Anne of Windy Poplars. The first year, Chapter 1, Anne Shirley arrives in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, to begin her new job as principal of Summerside High School, landing at her charming new boarding house known as Windy Poplars on Spooks Lane. She takes a train ride filled with classic Anne-style chaotic energy, accidentally punching a sleeping stranger's bald head thinking it was a seat armrest. Upon arriving in town, she navigates the local housing market until she discovers Windy Poplars, managed by two sweet elderly widows named Aunt Kate, Mrs. Amasa McComber, and Aunt Chatty, Mrs. Lincoln McLean, alongside their sharp-tongued, fiercely efficient housekeeper, Rebecca Dew. Anne also meets her noisy, meddling guide for the day, Mrs. Rachel Lynde, who warns her about the town's ruling family clan, the powerful and clannish Pringles, who are already salty because a third cousin of theirs didn't get the principal job. Despite the local politics, Anne falls head over heels for her cozy tower room, the quirky atmosphere of the house, its grumpy Maltese cat named Dusty Miller, and the surrounding spooky landscape, ultimately settling in and writing a deeply detailed love letter to her medical student fiancé, Gilbert Blythe. Chapter 2. 2 weeks into her new life, Anne escapes to a secret, dapple-sunlit birch grove across the road to read Gilbert's letters and cope with the absolute chaos of teaching at Summerside High. Her major daily boss-level struggle is dealing with the insubordinate, green-eyed student Jen Pringle, who is secretly orchestrating a low-key sabotage campaign and pulling hilarious yet disrespectful faces behind Anne's back, weaponizing her elite family's social status against the new principal. Anne is also forced to survive awkward, ultra-polite social dinners with members of the Pringle clan, including the pompous James Pringle, Jen's dad, the perpetually distracted Morton Pringle, and a passive-aggressive poison pen letter from the widow Pringle, Mrs. Stephen Pringle, demanding special academic treatment for her delicate daughter, Millie. Anne tries her absolute best to maintain a smooth, diplomatic, and creamy facade against the toxic school politics, even while battling late-night stress, setting up her classroom structure, and trying not to let the formidable Pringle lineage completely break her spirit. Anne writes further about the ongoing psychological warfare with the Pringles, noting that things are genuinely messy at Summerside High because of the student cabal, complete with uncompleted homework, upside-down desks, a pop-up artificial snake prank, a peeled onion in her coat pocket, and a brutally accurate chalk caricature of her looking like a sour spinster with carrot red hair. She also breaks down her interactions with the other local educators, including the shy, Highland-accented prep teacher George McKay, and the aggressively frozen vice principal Catherine Brooke, who secretly wanted the principal job, rocks a terrible aesthetic of dull greens and drabs, treats Anne with total frostiness, and forces Anne to sign her notes Catherine just to mess with her. Amidst the school stress, Anne bonds deeply with little Elizabeth Grayson, the pale, imaginative, and emotionally starved great-granddaughter of old Mrs. Campbell, who lives next door at the Evergreens under the tyrannical thumb of her stern great-grandmother and the ancient maid Martha Monkman, aka the Woman. Anne and Elizabeth share magical twilight chats across the garden wall, where Elizabeth talks about her coping mechanism of renaming herself Betty or Beth, depending on the vibe of the day, and her dreams of a utopian future called Tomorrow. Chapter 3. Anne finally receives and attends a high-stakes, ultra-exclusive dinner invitation to Maplehurst, the fortress-like homestead of the matriarchal elite Pringle sisters. She dresses up in her finest cream chalice dress with purple violets, stepping into an intimidating museum of ancestral swords, wax flower arrangements, and antique hair wreaths. She is hosted by the sharply elegant, hawk-nosed Miss Ellen Pringle and the quiet, heartbreakingly fragile Miss Sarah Pringle, the latter of whom pretends to be entirely deaf whenever Anne speaks, leaving Anne feeling like an absolute fly trapped on sticky paper and convinced she will have to resign by New Year's. Back at Windy Poplars, Aunt Chatty panics over a diamond-shaped bedsheet crease signaling an impending death, while household chaos peaks when the fluffy Maltese cat Dusty Miller finally returns home after an all-night bender completely battered, sporting a swollen jaw lump the size of an egg and missing eye slit, prompting an uncharacteristically proud reaction from Rebecca Dew, who gloats that the cat finally threw hands and won. Anne also confesses a hilarious, mortifying secret to Gilbert. On her very first morning at Windy Poplars, she completely forgot about her bed's funny little movable wooden steps and launched into a blithe morning spring that sent her crashing straight to the floor, leaving her black and blue for a week. Chapter 4. Anne hunkers down for the freezing November weather as Rebecca Dew sets up a tiny, pert, dog-shaped black ironwood stove in her tower room, which blooms rosy red with hardwood logs and provides cozy sanctuary. Outside of her room, Anne faces a relentless onslaught of local hospitality and community food traditions, namely being relentlessly force-fed jars of pumpkin preserves PP by well-meaning townsfolk who heard she was terrible partial to it, culminating in a secret midnight burial operation in the garden with Rebecca Dew to dispose of an unwanted jar gifted by Mrs. Hamilton, while Anne is uninvited to the Hardy Pringles grand dance and continues to battle local student insubordination and bad exam howlers like Blake Fenton defining an alligator as an insect. She receives sweet psychological magical relief via a 10-kiss postcard from Davy, ghostly cherry blossom paper letters from Priscilla, and a thick, savory love letter from Gilbert that she reads 4 times over like a dog polishing off a plate. Chapter 5. Feeling utterly defeated by the escalating Pringles student cabal, which recently peaked when Jen Pringle slipped a sharp insult into a composition assignment. Anne escapes to the spooky, fur-ringed old graveyard to clear her head. There, she is ambushed by the gossipy, ultra-ladylike local dressmaker, Miss Valentine Cordello, who cheerfully walks her through generations of local dead folks, dishing out wild historical lore about the buried Pringles, Cortallos, and McTabs, including a husband who supposedly ate a hat he hated, and a woman who predicted her exact minute of death. Anne reflects on how she survived her recent school drama, organizing a high-achieving dramatic club production of Mary Queen of Scots where Catherine Brooke aggressively cast Jen Pringle in the title role. When Jen tried to torpedo the play at the last minute by faking tonsillitis, Anne heroically substituted the shy, talented Sophie Sinclair into the lead role, allowing Sophie to steal the show in Velvet and Ruffs, permanently launching her acting future and delivering Jen a glorious, long-overdue comeuppance. Chapter 6. Anne writes to Gilbert reflecting on her graveyard excursion, noting how comedy and tragedy intertwine in human life, before pivoting back to her domestic routine, discovering that even Aunt Kate secretly sneaks into the pantry at night to apply buttermilk to her face for skincare while swearing Anne to secrecy. Little Elizabeth continues to slip over for evening milk runs under the watchful eye of the household, showing off a new dark wine dress and wishing aloud that her missing father could see her. Back at her desk, Anne faces the grim reality of grading geometrical exercises and preparing for the upcoming winter school grind, bolstered only by the warm wood stove fire and the constant comforting anchor of Gilbert's letters. Anne finishes up grading her geometry papers and stays warm by her tiny wood stove while writing to Gilbert about how the Pringles have completely accepted her. She also recounts visiting little Elizabeth Grayson over at the Evergreens to take her for a walk, noting how the child is starved for affection and desperately counts down the days until a utopian future she calls tomorrow. However, when Elizabeth returns after being kissed goodbye by Anne, her harsh guardian Martha Monkman the woman forces her to aggressively scrub the kiss off her face, though Anne promises to keep kissing her every single evening. Chapter 7. Anne visits Lowvale for a turkey supper with Wilfred Bryce, successfully convincing his reluctant uncle, Duncan Bryce, to let Wilfred finish his year at high school. While there, Anne roots through an old sea chest belonging to Uncle Andy Bryce, discovering an old logbook detailing wild stories about the legendary Captain Abraham Pringle and his brother Captain Myram Pringle, who allegedly survived a shipwreck by eating a crewmate. Worried that the scandalous cannibalism tale will destroy the proud Pringle family if leaked to local historian Mrs. Stanton, Anne instead mails the diary directly to the strict matriarch, Miss Sarah Pringle, as a peace offering. Terrified that Anne is blackmailing them with the Myram Pringle secret, Miss Sarah and her sister Miss Ellen shock the entire household by taking a rare carriage ride to Windy Poplars to personally capitulate, leading to a friendly chat, a treasured pound cake recipe, and the sudden, permanent end of the Shirley Pringle feud. Chapter 8. Anne writes another letter to Gilbert detailing her newly minted rock star status in Summerside, noting that the Pringles now treat her like royalty, invite her to parties, and even copy her hairstyle. She also describes visiting little Elizabeth again, who dreams of escaping her tyrannical grandmother and the woman, to live on a distant island called Flying Cloud. Meanwhile, Rebecca Dew successfully bakes a legendary 3-day sweated pound cake using Miss Sarah's recipe requiring an absurd 36 eggs, and Anne basks in the cozy, peaceful atmosphere of her tower room, feeling deeply grateful that her life and career are thriving. Chapter 9. A bubbly, plump local student named Trix Taylor visits Anne in her tower room to panic about an upcoming family dinner party where her shy sister Esme Taylor is hoping the gorgeous, hyper-fastidious Dr. Lennox Carter, head of modern languages at Redmond, will finally propose. Trix reveals the family's ultimate nightmare. Their tyrannical, Pringle-blooded father, Cyrus Taylor, is notorious for throwing silent, ice-cold, sulky fits whenever things don't go his way, such as losing a game of checkers or having his flannel nightshirts misplaced, which utterly paralyzes the household and threatens to tank Esme's marital prospects. Despite Trix's dread and Rebecca Dew's cynical kitchen commentary, Anne agrees to attend the dinner to help keep the peace. Chapter 10. Anne arrives at the Taylor household for dinner and immediately senses the Arctic chill of a full-blown Cyrus Taylor sulk, fueled by his recent checker loss to Hugh Pringle and his rage over finding Esme admiring herself in the mirror. Around the dining table, the atmosphere is suffocatingly tense. Timid Mrs. Cyrus Taylor is visibly fighting back tears. A pale Esme looks like she is about to faint, and Pringle Taylor sits frozen alongside a terrified Trix. Dr. Lennox Carter looks entirely bewildered as host Cyrus takes his seat at the head of the table in total, aggressive silence, refusing to say grace or utter a single word. leaving poor Anne desperately scrambling in her head for something, anything, to break the agonizingly heavy silence. In a desperate bid to break the heavy atmosphere, Anne casually remarks that Mr. Taylor went deaf the previous week, sparking a chaotic, unhinged retaliation from Trix and Pringle, who gleefully invent a barrage of absurd, humiliating accusations about their father biting his wife, cutting up dresses, and wearing overalls to funerals. Just as Cyrus finally erupts in fiery wrath, knocking over and shattering his late mother's ornate, hated vase. He suddenly bursts out laughing, admits to his bad habit of sulking, and restores cheerful harmony to the evening, eventually paving the way for Trix to bravely confess her romance to him and for the household to breathe easy again. Chapter 11. Anne pens a letter to Gilbert, recounting the aftermath of the Taylor dinner, celebrating the wonderful news that Esme Taylor and Dr. Lennox Carter are officially engaged, largely thanks to the chivalrous protective instinct Dr. Carter felt during that chaotic Friday night. Meanwhile, Anne's social standing in Summerside is at an all-time high, with her Pringle students including a newly reconciled Jen Pringle treating her like royalty, and her bond with little Elizabeth Grayson growing ever stronger as they map out imaginary fairylands filled with whimsical times. Anne also delights in realizing her own comparative beauty, as noted by Rebecca Dew, and she eagerly counts down the remaining weeks of the school year until she can finally return to Avonlea, Green Gables, and Gilbert. Chapter 12. As glorious spring weather blankets Summerside in dandelions, blooming fruit trees, and buzzing robins. Anne visits a frequent acquaintance, a sweet, trapped middle-aged woman named Pauline Gibson, whose life is entirely consumed by waiting hand and foot on her miserable, demanding 80-year-old mother, Mrs. Adoniram Gibson, who uses guilt and leaving things to consciences to crush Pauline's every joy, including preventing her from attending a cousin's silver wedding. Incensed by the tyranny, Anne boldly resolves to secure Pauline's freedom for the weekend, while also juggling wedding invitations from Sally Nelson, wrapping up her highly successful first year at Summerside High, where the Pringles are now her greatest fans, and happily preparing for her upcoming summer vacation back home. Chapter 13. Anne heroically spends her weekend playing nursemaid to the impossible 80-year-old Mrs. Adoniram Gibson, so that her long-suffering 45-year-old daughter, Pauline Gibson, can finally escape for a single day to attend her cousin's silver wedding and visit the old, Luckley place. After enduring hours of incessant whining, insults, and hypochondriac complaints, and sneaking Pauline out in a borrowed gray poplin dress hidden beneath an old black taffeta, Anne successfully keeps the peace by wheeling the old tyrant onto the porch to smell the crab blossoms, leaving Pauline free to experience the absolute magic of the sea breeze, old friends, and an unforgettable day of freedom. Chapter 14. Pauline returns from her magical day at the wedding, looking a decade younger, full of glowing memories of her old friend, Mary Luckley, Mrs. Howard Fleming, sweet conversations with an old beau, Captain Isaac Kent, and the pure bliss of wandering by the Gulf at sunset, leaving her fortified with enough happiness to cheerfully return to her endless duties caring for her demanding mother. Chapter 15. Anne arrives at Bonnyview, the sprawling stone summer home of Dr. Nelson nestled among spruces and dunes, which is bursting at the seams with laughing guests, overflowing kids, and Dr. Nelson's stoic black cats, Barnabas and Saul, sitting like sphinxes on the veranda. As bride Sally Nelson shows off her dreamy cream silk and pearl wedding gown and vents about her catty frenemies, the household is utterly horror-stricken by the sudden, early arrival of Aunt Mauser, the toxic, pop-eyed family matriarch, Mrs. James Kennedy, who earned her nickname for constantly mousing around and dropping morbid, unsolicited insults. During a chaotic lantern-lit dinner on the Glaston porch, Aunt Mauser relentlessly fires off her signature felicities, mocking the guests' outfits, predicting strokes, and publicly digging into Nora Nelson's painfully single status. Later that night, a deeply depressed and heartbroken Nora retreats to the rocky shore by the bay to vent her raw misery to Anne, confessing that she is utterly consumed by jealousy over Sally's wedding and agonizingly hopeless that her estranged ex-beau, Jim Wilcox, will ever return. The chapter peaks when Nora, completely overwrought by Aunt Mauser's relentless nagging at breakfast, shockingly loses her temper and slaps a groomsman right across both cheeks before fleeing the room in tears. Chapter 16. The morning of Sally's wedding is a frantic whirlwind of last-minute preparations and Aunt Mauser's cheerful death knell prognostications. But the ceremony goes off without a hitch, as Sally and Gordon Hill are safely married to the strains of Nora's wedding march. Later that night, after the guests leave and the exhausted teenagers prep for a moonlit bonfire on the shore, Anne is struck by a sudden, impulsive stroke of matchmaking genius. She sneaks up to the attic and places a glowing hand lamp in the dormer window to signal Jim Wilcox across the bay. Hours later, a terrified Aunt Mauser wakes the entire household screaming about a burglary, leading a frantic rescue party down to the library, where they discover Jim Wilcox holding a bloody handkerchief to Nora's nose after she accidentally smashed her face into the door while rushing down to greet him. When Aunt Mauser aggressively demands that Jim marry her on the spot to save her reputation, a cornered Jim fires back and formally proposes on the spot, prompting a wildly shameless "oh won't I" from Nora that leaves everyone stunned. With the dramatic romance successfully sealed, the household finally settles down, leaving Nora completely transformed and deeply grateful to Anne for engineering her happily ever after. Chapter 17. Anne writes a final letter to Gilbert detailing the triumphant end of her first year in Summerside, celebrating the start of her sweet 2-month summer vacation back home at Green Gables, with its spicy ferns, dappling shadows, and sunlit Avonlea meadows. She notes that Jen Pringle dropped off a kind farewell bouquet of lilies of the valley, while little Elizabeth Grayson is utterly heartbroken that she cannot visit, choosing to rename the backyard chipmunk Shirley to keep Anne close to her heart. Anne also reflects on her complicated feelings of guilt regarding Catherine Brooke staying behind in a lonely boarding house, chuckles at Rebecca Dew's ongoing war against rose-eating beetles, and shares the thrilling news that Nora Nelson will quietly marry Jim Wilcox in September to permanently escape Aunt Mauser's clutches. Closing her letter with deep romantic devotion, Anne bids farewell to Summerside as she prepares to transition straight into her cozy, drama-filled second year at Windy Poplars. The second year, Chapter 1, Anne arrives back at Windy Poplars for her second year, thrilled to return to her cozy tower room, her private chair, and the warm welcome of the widows, Rebecca Dew and little Elizabeth Grayson, who has spent the summer softly meditating on the magic of tomorrow and her deep obsession with elephants. Returning to her high school classroom, Anne preps for a Canadian history lecturette on the War of 1812 and joins forces with her ambitious, hardworking pupil Lewis Allen to canvass the scenic Dawlish Road for dramatic club subscriptions. Lewis is juggling his high school classes while doing housework to pay his board, motivating Anne and Aunt Kate to strike a deal with Rebecca Dew, sacrificing $1 of Rebecca's wages to fund Sunday night suppers for Lewis so he can finally escape his chronic malnourishment. Meanwhile, the household is tickled when Aunt Chatty boldly decides to buy a jaunty beaded cape and defy Aunt Kate's stern judgment, leaving Anne to happily settle into her tower and blow a midnight kiss toward Avonlea. Chapter 2. Anne and Lewis spend a gorgeous autumn afternoon wandering along the winding Dawlish Road, joking about canvassing tactics, sipping from birch bark cups at a mossy spring, and riding out a sudden torrential rainstorm inside a deserted blacksmith's forge. Afterward, they explore a side road leading down to the harbor and stumble upon a picturesque, weather-gray farmhouse with a flourishing, up-to-date barn, where they are abruptly shut out by an ungracious, grizzled hermit. Shortly after, they are greeted by the hermit's adorable, golden-haired 8-year-old son, Teddy Armstrong, affectionately dubbed the Little Fellow, who generously shares his apple turnover with them. The child's sweet, motherless disposition immediately captures Anne's heart, and Lewis snaps a lovely photograph of the boy and his Newfoundland dog, Carlo, before parting ways. Back at Windy Poplars, Rebecca Dew explains that the boy's father, James Armstrong, completely broke down and turned into a bitter hermit after his young wife died 5 years prior, isolating the child from the outside world while worshiping him as his sole reason for living. Chapter 3. Nearly 3 weeks later, Lewis develops the photographs, and the picture of the little fellow turns out so strikingly real that Rebecca Dew notices a bizarre, uncanny resemblance between the boy's facial structure and Lewis's own childhood features. When Lewis and Anne drive out to Glen Cove Road in an antiquated buggy borrowed from Mr. Bender to deliver the photo, they are utterly devastated when Mr. Merrill informs them that the little fellow tragically died of pneumonia 3 weeks prior, leaving his father a broken, suicidal wreck. Arriving at the Armstrong homestead, they find James Armstrong plunged in agonizing grief. But when Lewis hands him the photograph, the grieving father bursts into tears of pure relief, finally able to remember his son's face. In the emotional aftermath, James realizes that Lewis is actually his long-lost nephew through his half-sister, Mary Gardner, forging an instant family bond. The chapter concludes with Lewis moving in with his grieving uncle to help fill the empty void left by the little fellow, while James warmly invites Anne back, remembering how much his son adored her. Chapter 4. On a freezing December night, Anne braves the bitter cold to walk over to Temple Street and invite her notoriously bitter, icy colleague Catherine Brooke to spend the Christmas holidays with her at Green Gables. Despite Rebecca Dew's stern warnings that Catherine will undoubtedly reject the gesture as charity and insult her, Anne insists that beneath Catherine's prickly, defensive exterior lies a deeply lonely and profoundly unhappy soul that just needs a little holiday warmth to thaw her out. Upon arriving at Catherine's dismal boarding house, Anne confronts Catherine's gossipy landlady, Mrs. Dennis, and successfully persuades her to finally allow Catherine to keep a dog, before heading upstairs to the bleak, cheerless room. When Anne extends her holiday invitation, Catherine initially responds with sharp, sarcastic barbs. However, after Anne bluntly tells her she needs a good spanking to shake off her misery, Catherine unexpectedly breaks down, drops her icy defenses, and agrees to go to Green Gables because she cannot bear the thought of spending the holidays completely alone. Chapter 5. Anne and Catherine arrive at Green Gables and are greeted by a snowy wonderland and a joyous welcome from Marilla, Mrs. Rachel Lynde, and the twins, Davy and Dora. Catherine is instantly swept up in the cozy magic of the farmhouse, enjoying a glowing supper by Mrs. Lynde's crimson-globed parlor lamp and embarking on a breathtaking moonlit snowshoe tramp through Lover's Lane. During their walk, the winter night melts away Catherine's final defenses, and she opens up to Anne about her miserable, loveless childhood being unwanted by her parents, her grueling years of being treated like a charity case by her Uncle Henry, and how her chronic bitterness and self-isolation were born from a desperate fear of rejection. Anne responds with deep empathy, assuring her that life is only just beginning now that she is fully independent. The chapter closes with Catherine feeling profoundly transformed and deeply grateful for Anne's friendship, eagerly looking forward to experiencing her very first real Christmas. Chapter 6. Christmas at Green Gables is an absolute whirlwind of joyful festivities, featuring plum pudding concoctions, festive wood-chopping excursions for a little fir tree, and a heartwarming Christmas morning where the household exchanges gifts, culminating in Anne surprising Catherine with a precious brown-eyed puppy. Catherine blooms in the warm, loving environment, bonding with Davy and shedding her old, abrasive personality as they spend their holiday walking through snow-kissed woods and visiting Diana Barry and her new baby. Through the magic of Green Gables, Catherine finally discovers what it means to be truly happy and loved, shedding her toxic bitterness for good, and stepping into a bright, hopeful future alongside her newfound best friend, Anne. Chapter 7. Anne pens a cheerful letter to Gilbert detailing her return to Windy Poplars, where Rebecca Dew and the widows welcome her back warmly and shares the heartwarming triumph of how she skillfully maneuvered around the formidable Mrs. Campbell to allow little Elizabeth Grayson to sing in her school concert. Meanwhile, Catherine's life undergoes a stunning transformation as she attends a grand dance wearing a dark red silk dress and showcasing a radiant new attitude that leaves everyone wondering who she is. Back at Windy Poplars, Aunt Chatty battles a feverish cold while Rebecca Dew nervously fusses over the house. Chapter 8. The household is suddenly descended upon by Cousin Ernestine Bugle, a relentlessly pessimistic and gossipy relative from Lowvale, who brings down the mood of every meal with her endless doom-casting, hypochondriac medical warnings and dark prophecies about everyone she knows. Wearing her decrepit Hudson seal neck piece indoors, Cousin Ernestine spreads misery by predicting imminent tragedies, fatal illnesses, and unhappy marriages for the entire neighborhood. Despite her dreary presence and constant harassment of the household, including criticizing the geraniums and warning Anne that red-haired people lack strong constitutions, Rebecca Dew fires back with sharp comebacks while serving pear preserves and macaroons, until Cousin Ernestine finally departs before dark, fearing a sudden storm and a bout of ammonia. Chapter 9. Anne writes a playful letter to Gilbert parodying Cousin Ernestine's chronic doom and gloom mindset by listing a string of absurd fears, such as getting hydrophobia from Mr. Hamilton's dog and her umbrella turning inside out, while reflecting fondly on her unbreakable bond with Catherine and looking forward to their upcoming evening together. Chapter 10. Anne receives a visit in the tower room from Hazel Marr, a dramatic, self-absorbed newcomer from Charlottetown, known as an October blonde who has an intense crush on Anne and is currently having a melodramatic crisis over her engagement to Terry Garland, complaining that she was merely moonlighted into it. A few weeks later, after Hazel leaves for Kingsport, Terry and Anne grow closer while walking home, and Anne, believing Hazel genuinely wants out, impulsively tells Terry that Hazel doesn't actually love him, unwittingly setting the stage for a massive storm. Chapter 11. While battling a severe, unromantic summer cold in the head, Anne is aggressively ambushed in the tower room by a furious Hazel, who has returned from Kingsport to discover that Anne supposedly tried to steal Terry away. Hazel launches into a hysterical, over-the-top tirade accusing Anne of betraying her friendship and ruining her life, leaving Anne completely exasperated and wishing she could just give the dramatic girl a good spanking before finally telling her to leave. Chapter 12. A week later, Anne receives a passive-aggressive, silver-edged letter from Hazel announcing that she and Terry have completely made up after realizing they are soulmates, and patronizingly forgiving Anne for her interference while tossing in a petty parting shot, suggesting Anne use lemon juice to bleach her nose freckles. Chapter 13. Anne packs up her things and leaves Windy Poplars for her second summer vacation in Avonlea, accompanied by little Elizabeth Grayson, whom she successfully rescued from Mrs. Campbell's clutches for a blissful 2-week getaway at Green Gables. The third year, Chapter 1. As Anne returns to Windy Poplars for her third and final year at Summerside High, she finds life largely unchanged, except for the old red cow passing away and the looming decision to give away Dusty Miller, the cat, to satisfy Rebecca Dew, while also preparing to babysit Mrs. Raymond's 8-year-old angelic-looking twins, Gerald and Geraldine, whose mother is heading to Charlottetown for a funeral and who are notoriously wild despite their saintly appearances. Chapter 2. Anne arrives at Mrs. Raymond's cottage to babysit the angelic yet chaotic twins, Gerald and Geraldine, and soon has to contend with an endless encyclopedia pitch from the relentless Miss Pamela Drake on the front porch. While Anne is trapped, Gerald and Geraldine launch a triple hook fishing rod out the upstairs window and yank off Miss Drake's hat, spectacles, and false front in a hilarious ambush that sends the defeated saleswoman packing. Chapter 3. After Mr. Grand visits to discuss high school board matters, the Raymond twins engage in a brutal turf war with the impeccably dressed and condescending Ivy Trent over hair bows and shoulder ribbons. The twins overpower Ivy in the woodshed, tear off her accessories, and adorn her legs with broad stripes of red and green paint before sending her sobbing down the street. Chapter 4. A furious Mrs. Trent arrives with a sobbing Ivy, prompting Anne to finally crack down and punish the twins by sending Geraldine to bed and locking Gerald in the hall closet. Gerald escapes through the window onto the porch roof, steals Mr. Creedmore's boat to go poling on the pond, falls into the water, and triggers a dramatic, tear-soaked rescue leap from Geraldine, ending with the doctor's visit, a tearful Mrs. Raymond returning from the station, and Anne fleeing the house vowing never to babysit again. Chapter 5. Anne writes a long letter to Gilbert detailing the local gossip surrounding the stalled romance between Jarvis Morrow, a successful young lawyer, and Jen Pringle's cousin, and Dovie Westcott, the pretty, plump, sooty-lashed 19-year-old daughter of the formidable Franklin Westcott, while also expressing growing concern over little Elizabeth Grayson's bleak spiritual and emotional future with her elderly guardians. Chapter 6. During a chat after the high school commencement, Jarvis Morrow complains to Anne that his engagement to Dovie is going nowhere because Dovie is too terrified of her authoritarian father to elope, prompting Anne to bluntly advise Jarvis that he must force Dovie to finally choose between her father and him. Chapter 7. When Dovie fails to show up for her secret wedding while her father is away in Charlottetown, a desperate Jarvis runs to Windy Poplars and begs Anne to go straight to Elmcroft to find out why. Anne marches up to the spooky estate, storms upstairs, and practically bullies a hesitant Dovie out of bed, packing her into her rose taffeta dress and escorting her into town to finally marry Jarvis. Chapter 8. Dreading the worst, Anne nervously walks to Elmcroft the next evening to break the news of the elopement to the dreaded Franklin Westcott, a stern, open-window-loving merchant famous for his fiery temper and sarcastic tantrums, only to discover to her absolute shock that Westcott is privately thrilled, revealing that he deliberately played the heavy parent and banned Jarvis to manipulate the notoriously spineless Dovie into defying him, because he knew the proud Morrow men only fight harder for what they are told they cannot have. Chapter 9. Anne writes to Gilbert about receiving a hyper-elite invitation to the legendary Tom Gallen house from the sole surviving Miss Minerva Tom Gallen, while also chronicling the hilarious, high-stakes domestic warfare between the widows and Rebecca Dew over Dusty Miller the cat, and privately confessing that she secretly mailed a daring letter to little Elizabeth Grayson's absentee father in Paris. Chapter 10. Anne arrives at the towering, foreboding Tom Gallen house for her dinner party, where the regal and dramatic Miss Minerva regales her with a non-stop macabre parade of family tragedies, including ancestors who fell downstairs, burned alive, swallowed wedding rings, poisoned husbands with toadstools, and succumbed to the notorious curse of the Tom Gallens. Chapter 11. After a lavish supper of peaches and Old Crown Derby fare, Anne spends the evening playing parcheesi with Miss Minerva and sleeping in Aunt Annabella's room under the watchful, vain eyes of a family portrait before returning to Windy Poplars the next morning and writing to Gilbert about her unforgettable night immersed in the ghost-filled history of yesterday. Chapter 12. As June marks the final weeks of Anne's time in Summerside, 10-year-old little Elizabeth Grayson falls into deep despair, knowing her beloved teacher is leaving forever, feeling utterly trapped under the icy, tyrannical thumb of her unloving grandmother and the woman while still waiting desperately for word from her long-lost father. Chapter 13. During a magical afternoon walk with Anne to the slender islet of Flying Cloud under the guise of visiting a ladies' aid convener, little Elizabeth wanders into a house and unexpectedly meets a crinkly-eyed, smiling man who turns out to be her long-lost father, Pierce Grayson, who has finally returned from France in response to Anne's secret letter, whisking her away to a bright new future in Boston, and freeing her forever from her oppressive home. Chapter 14. In her final bittersweet letter to Gilbert from her iconic tower room, Anne wraps up her 3 incredible years at Windy Poplars, bidding a fond farewell to the reformed Pringles, the tearful and loving Rebecca Dew, and the entire household, before joyfully preparing to return home to Green Gables, reunite with Gilbert, and finally step foot into her long-awaited house of dreams.